All right, today we're jumping into something pretty wild. A maker's quest to recreate a forgotten piece of atomic age art, uranium glass.
You know, when the person behind this project first even heard about uranium glass, his reaction was just total disbelief. He said, "I thought that it was some marketing thing, but it's actually real." And well, that little discovery kicked off a fascinating and a slightly radioactive project.
So that's the big question, right? What really happens when you mix glass with uranium? The answer, it turns out, is a wild ride, involving some pretty clever chemistry, incredibly high temperatures, and, as you're about to see, a very unexpected and dramatic setback.
Okay, so, first up, let's get to know the object of this whole quest, the glowing glass itself.
So what is uranium glass? Well, it's pretty much what it sounds like. It's just normal glass, but with a tiny amount of uranium mixed right in. And that little addition is what creates its most famous, most mesmerizing feature. This vibrant, almost eerie green glow when you put it under a UV light. That's the magic we're chasing here. You know, this stuff has a really weird history. It was actually super popular back in the late 1800s for things like dinnerware and little decorative items. But then, World War II happened and all the uranium got snapped up for nuclear research, which basically killed the industry overnight. It tried to make a comeback later, but let's just say public opinion on anything nuclear had shifted. Now, it's a rare collector's item, which means if you really want some, you might have to make it yourself.
And that brings us to the very first major hurdle in this whole adventure, the uranium chemistry challenge.
The raw ingredient he started with was uranyl nitrate, and it makes these beautiful yellow crystals, but you can't let that fool you. This stuff is water-soluble, it's toxic, and it's radioactive. The real key here was being super careful, especially about not creating any dust, because inhaling it could lead to heavy metal poisoning.
But here's the problem he immediately ran into. Is this actually the right stuff to put in glass? After digging through what little information is even out there, the answer was a big, fat no.
See, the uranyl nitrate he had dissolves in water, which is not what you want for a glass recipe. The correct ingredient, according to all the old-school methods, is something called sodium diuranate, which is insoluble. So, the mission was clear. He had to do some actual uranium chemistry to turn one into the other.
So he got to work. He dissolved the nitrate in water, slowly added a sodium hydroxide solution, and bam, a precipitate formed instantly. He filtered it all out, dried it carefully, and he was left with this bright yellow sodium diuranate powder. First challenge officially complete.
Okay, with the right chemical finally in hand, it was time for the really fun part, forging the first batch of glass. Now, you might think making glass is just, melting sand, but the melting point of sand, or silica, is crazy high, around 1700 degrees Celsius. Way too hot for a small furnace. The trick is to add other stuff, like sodium carbonate and boric acid, which act as a flux and bring that melting point way down. What you end up with is a borosilicate glass, kind of like Pyrex, which is also way more resistant to temperature shock.
So how much of that precious uranium powder do you actually need to get that signature glow? You're going to be surprised. For this first attempt, the recipe called for just 0.25% uranium by weight, a teeny tiny amount.
After melting the whole mixture in the furnace and pouring it onto a graphite block, this was it, the moment of truth. He hits it with the UV light, and at first, the glow was pretty faint, but as the glass cooled down to room temperature, wow, it just came alive with that brilliant, bright yellow-green glow he was looking for. Success. Or so it seemed.
Yeah, not so much. Because the very next morning, the project took a dramatic and completely unexpected turn. This was a shattering setback.
He came back to his workshop, only to find that the beautiful glowing glass disc he'd made the night before had just spontaneously broken, overnight.
And if that wasn't dramatic enough, the second piece he'd made literally broke right in front of him. In his own words, it responded by splitting in half right when it was sitting in front of me. This wasn't just bad luck. Something was fundamentally wrong with his process.
So what on earth was going on? The culprit is something called internal stress. Think about it. When glass cools down too fast, the outside surface gets hard and solidifies, while the inside is still basically a molten liquid and is shrinking. This creates a massive, invisible tension that gets locked inside the glass, just waiting for a reason to release, often pretty explosively.
And this is where the real art and science of glassmaking comes into play. The final section, taming the final product.
The solution is a process called annealing, and it is the absolute secret to making stable glass. The whole idea is to hold the glass piece at a pretty high temperature for hours, hot enough for the atoms to kind of relax and rearrange themselves, but not hot enough to melt. Then you cool it down incredibly slowly. This whole process gently lets go of all that locked-in internal stress.
So after another pour, he placed a large disc into the furnace for an overnight annealing session. Now, there was a little mishap where he accidentally cracked the surface, but the annealing process worked perfectly. It stabilized the glass, locking those cool, unique cracks in place and creating a final, beautiful, and most importantly, stable piece.
Of course, the final question is, how radioactive is this stuff anyway? A more sensitive Geiger counter showed a reading of about 5.5 microsieverts per hour for the big disk. To put that into perspective, holding it right up against your cheek is like getting one dental X-ray every 2 hours. So it's generally safe to handle from time to time, but maybe don't carry it around in your pocket every day.
So, what did we really learn from this whole quest? Well, we saw that the iconic glow is all about fluorescence, that you need a little bit of chemistry to deal with those insane melting temperatures, and that cooling glass too fast creates enough internal stress to literally tear it apart from the inside out. But the real hero of the story is that final, patient step, annealing. And in the end, the so-called atomic glass is actually only mildly radioactive.
And all of this leaves you with a really fascinating thought, doesn't it? This entire process, from the chemistry to the annealing, was recreated by a hobbyist in a workshop. It makes you wonder, if one person can safely figure this out today, why did an entire industry that was once so popular almost completely vanish?